Welcome to the Education Investment Podcast. In a world where investors are looking for stable and growing long-term returns with social impact, the education sector is becoming increasingly attractive. We speak to leading educators, operators, and investors in the education sector around the world to explore this growing investment theme alongside our listeners. From preschools to K-12 schools to higher education and vocational education. From edtech to education infrastructure. From VC investors to private equity and family offices, we explore it all. I'm your host, Monde Nkosi. Education has always been a big part of my life because my mother founded a school which was across the road from our home. I have benefited from excellent schools and teachers in South Africa and the US. I went on to study education and am now very grateful to be an investor in this sector that I love.
All opinions expressed by podcast guests are solely their own opinions. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions.
Today, I am privileged to host Dr. Mark Abell for a conversation on international expansion in education. There is a growing trend of independent schools and universities expanding internationally. For instance, while many people think of Harrow as a single school in the UK, there are now more than 10 Harrow International Schools in Asia through a partnership between Harrow and Asia International Schools Limited. In today's conversation, we dive deep into the why and how of this trend in education. And there's no one better to do that with than today's guest, Dr. Mark Abell. Mark is a highly regarded international lawyer with over 40 years' experience. He has advised over 80 independent schools and universities on international expansion, including the likes of Westminster, London Collegiate, Wellington College, Dulwich, Oxford, Cambridge, and Surrey. Mark has also found the time to author 13 books, including Educational Institutions, a Legal and Regulatory Handbook for setting up overseas. Mark holds a Bachelor of Laws from the University of Southampton and a PhD from the University of London, where his PhD thesis was on the regulation of franchising in the EU. Mark, it's wonderful to have you on. Welcome to the pod.
Thanks very much, Monde. Pleasure to be here.
Thanks, Mark. So just to start off, we'd love to learn about you and your journey. Tell us where you grew up and a bit about your family and what ultimately attracted you to education.
Sure, my pleasure. Well, I was born in D.H. Lawrence country on the Derby-Notts border into a family of teachers. But pretty soon after that, I moved to Singapore and I lived there for over 10 years. Had a great time. But came back to the UK, to Bury St Edmunds in Suffolk, to do my GCSEs and A-levels. After that, moved on to Southampton University, where I studied law. My PhD was from Queen Mary and Westfield College, University of London. I did a year with the College of Law for my professional exams. And then I moved on to work as a teacher in Japan because in my mind I'd always thought that I would be an academic, and that seemed to be a good step into it. But after that, I came back to the UK and decided instead to go into the city to practice law. And in due course, I became a partner in one of the large international law firms. My practice focused mostly upon international growth through non-corporate structures, whether that's licensing, franchising, joint ventures, etc. And I worked through a whole range of different commercial sectors. It was in the early 2000s when Tony Selwyn was internationalizing Wellington College that I first really came across the whole educational field. And Tony and his team approached me, asked me to help them in their entry into China. Now, I sort of fessed up and said, well, I do a lot of work taking businesses into China, but frankly, I know very little about education. But interestingly enough, at that time, there were many excellent law firms with real expertise in domestic education in the UK, but they had really no expertise no knowledge of internationalization, which really disqualified them from giving appropriate advice. The other potential source of advice was from other large city law firms, but they had no real interest in the educational sector because, frankly, they could make more money elsewhere. I did have an interest in education because of my background and having taught for a while. So I decided if he was willing to be patient, I was willing to invest the time. And I helped them enter China. Then we did something else in India, which actually didn't close. But Wellington were happy, and they very graciously recommended me to other schools. And before I knew it, certainly by the end of 2010, international education comprised the vast majority of my practice. And, I found it a really intellectually stimulating and interesting sector. I found the people there a delight to work with. I guess coming from a background of teachers, I just found a natural link with the clients. And lucky for me, for various reasons, it became the thing in more and more schools. And then universities decided they wanted to internationalize. And you know what they say, the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. And so I was in the right place at the right time. And that was my practice as a partner in one of the large international law firms until in 22, I decided I'd had enough. And so I left the city and to work with a portfolio of schools who were very much focused upon growing internationally. Some of them new entrants, a good number of them with a good number of schools already established internationally, but keen to continue to grow. And that's what I'm doing now. I'm very lucky. I work with terrific schools like Gordonston, Queen Elizabeth, etc. And we're doing fantastic projects, really interesting in really interesting markets. And I'm having a ball.
That's wonderful to hear, and I can see that come through as you're speaking. One of the themes that was really interesting as you were speaking is when you get these. It's not quite a coincidence, but things happening together where you are early in a field and you build expertise in it, and then that field grows more and more and becomes more and more important, and you become the go-to person. I think we're seeing some of that in, for instance, some of the AI stuff that's going on now, and the people who've been working on that for a decade plus are suddenly really needed and sought after, and it's fascinating that this happened with you and international expansion in education.
Absolutely.
And if I come back a little bit to your upbringing and your family. So you mentioned briefly that you had a family of teachers. So I'd love to learn a bit more about your parents. And were you an only child, or did you have some siblings?
I had a sister. My mother was a nurse, and my father was a teacher, a headmaster in a primary school, and his brother and my cousins all went into education. So I was from an early age surrounded by teachers. And my father taught in Singapore and Malaysia, and that's why the family moved out there. And I think that was I didn't know it at the time, but it was an eye-opener because, I learned that British education wasn't the only form of education. I think made me slightly aware of some of the strengths and the weaknesses of British education. And just living in a polyethnic, polycultural environment, I think laid the ground for me in the future. And that's probably, why I went and lived in Japan. And I was fortunate. I met my wife, who's Japanese. She'd just come back from Cambridge at the time. And our children is polyethnic. My daughter's adopted from China. My son's adopted from Thailand, and the dog's German. So we really are very polyethnic. And I think that's given me a real affinity for international work. and also for education. When I used to do a lot of work with schools in China, and my greatest qualification, I think, for the Chinese companies that I was working with was my daughter graduated from Oxford with a double first in theoretical physics. And as a parent, it's just a spectator sport. It's nothing to do really with much that you do. It is just the child. But all of the Chinese companies I was working with thought, this guy knows what he's doing. He's managed to get his daughter a double first from Oxford. Of course, that shows a fundamental, I think, misunderstanding of education and children.
Yes.
But my family's always been with me on my journey, professional and personal.
That's wonderful to hear, Mark, and that is a very international household. What's clear there is clearly this was one of your formative experiences, the moving around that you did as a child and in your early life. I'm intrigued by that point at which you finish studying law, and then you decide to move to Japan and become a teacher. So, what were you teaching? Firstly, I'm interested in that, and how was that experience? How was your first year, for instance, as a teacher?
Right. Well, originally I was meant to go and work as a lecturer in English law at Rouen University. But when I thought long and hard about it, France really wasn't far enough away. And I think, again, it's those early experiences I had of Southeast Asia that pulled me to Japan. It seemed to be the place of the future. And so I worked in a corporate organization that taught English and law to Japanese business people. And so it was quite an experience. I think I probably learned a lot more, I have to say, than the students I were teaching. But they're all professional business people who were highly focused on improving their linguistic skills and learning about English and European law. So it was a bit of a doddle from that point of view. There was nothing about having to inspire people. They were way there. But I learned a lot about Japan, about the culture there, about politics, about the economy. And it was terrific. But I enjoyed it a lot. But it did, I think, it made me focus on, do I want to go back into academia in the UK, or do I want to do something where I'm going to have more of an opportunity to work internationally? And it was that international aspect that really drew me into the city. And again, as Napoleon said, give me lucky generals. It was the right time. I was in the right place. I came back to the city, and the one thing that every firm wanted was a Japanese-speaking lawyer. And crazy though it sounds, there's only one other person in the city who spoke any Japanese at the time. So again, that one-eyed man in the land of the blind seemed to do pretty well.
Is this when Japan was more or less on top of the world in sort of Japanese
Absolutely.
real estate and the stock market? Okay, got it.
Absolutely. Before the bubble
that
burst.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Okay, that makes sense. And I'm interested then, coming from such an international household, what are some of your main interests outside of work, music or sport or theatre or anything of the sort?
Well, my big passion from university days has been Taekwondo, the Korean martial arts. And I still practice that 2-3 times a week, a little bit of teaching and, trying to climb that black belt ladder. My ultimate aim would be to get my 5th dan, but I suspect that's not going to happen. But, 1 or 2 more steps and I'll be there. So that's great. I also do some creative writing where it's really a journey, not the destination. But I enjoy that. My family's, very important to me.
In that writing, that passion for writing, does that include the 13 books that you've written? Or is this over and above the 13 books?
And that's over and above that, but they're all sort of basically legal and commercial books. But now I'm going on into a more fiction-driven genre. And so I'm learning a lot there. And I guess, we have a house in Japan, so we like to spend spring there so we can see the cherry blossoms. And we like to go in autumn so we can see the koyo, the turning of the leaves into all those reds, golds, yellows. Those are two very special times of year in Japan. And so we like to spend a month or two in spring and summer there.
You're making me jealous here. This sounds like a very fun life since you've left sort of international law based in London and working whatever it is, 15-hour days. This sounds like a far nicer pace. Look, thanks, Mark, for sharing both on your journey, but also a bit about your family as well. That was really fascinating. And I obviously learned some stuff here that I didn't know. So let's move on then to some of the main topics for discussion in international expansion in education. Let's just start off. How broad is this trend of schools or universities wanting to leave their home market and expand internationally?
I think I can say it's a broad trend. I mean, if you look at the figures, the global expenditure on K-12 education back in 2020 was about $3.5 trillion US dollars. 2 years later, it was 5.5 trillion. And the forecasts are that by 2030, it's going to be way over 10 trillion US dollars. Now, that's just a forecast. But certainly what I see is year on year growing attention to this sector, and not just in K-12. And it's right from kindergarten through to higher education. And we're seeing all sorts of sub-trends in there, one of which is vertically integrated education from kindergartens right through to postgraduate higher education degrees. So there's a lot going on. Adding to that the whole ed tech trend, and there's a lot happening. Why it's happening? Well, some of it is because it's a way of making money, and commercial organizations want to be a part of that. Some is because the way that education is run in the UK, for example, is being challenged by tax regimes, by changing charitable status, political agendas, and so on. So private education in the UK in particular is seeing the need to diversify and to make sure they're going to be around in a couple of 100 years' time. So there's that trend. Then at the same time, you're seeing a desire in a number of what used to be called developing nations to bring in as many different types of education as possible. And, back in the 90s, the UAE and China were the go-to markets. There was a big demand, not just for expats, but for the local indigenous population. And that developed. There's a number of waves, really, that went on. I guess my analysis, and, it's just my analysis, so shoot me down, I could be wrong. But I think you had what I call the early adopters. You had in the UK schools like Wellington, like Dulwich, like Brighton College, who decided this is what we got to do for a variety of different reasons, and we're going to do it. And you know what? We're just going to make it happen. And they were, buccaneering, if you like. They decided to go and do it, and if they failed, they failed, but somehow they get through. And I'm lucky enough to have worked with all, I think I can say, those early adopters. Not in their first sorties out there, but they went, they did it, they got it wrong, and so they needed not all of them, but many of them needed help in restructuring it, and that's where I became involved. But the fact is, they did it. They set up schools, they started generating income, and that led to what I'd call the second wave, the Me Too. If they can do it, I can do it. I need the money as much as they do. And so that second wave, they come in and they're trying to do the same thing in the same markets. Then you get what I'd call the third wave. They see what's happening and they think, yeah, I actually want to do that. So they go into the same markets, but they try and compete on price, and they tend to drive the market down. The next wave, I think, are probably the most interesting. They're the disruptors. They're the ones who say, well, hold on, everyone's doing this, so maybe I should do it as well. And I think until the third wave, there'd always been a slight snobbery in the UK amongst independent schools. Well, I wouldn't want our school to do that. But I think the game changer in the UK came when Westminster College decided they were going into China. And suddenly, all of the other independent schools in the UK thought, well, Westminster, like it or not, are probably the leading independent school. And if they're doing it, maybe we should. And when the disruptors came, they looked at the market and they thought, we can't compete on price alone. The market's becoming saturated. So they looked at different ways of doing it. And I was very lucky to be very much involved with that. So we looked at how can we compete in different markets with different models, different financial structures. Should we be offering just educational services rather than the whole brand? Should we be looking at offering to run the schools, etc., etc.? So those disruptors came and they had a real impact on the market, so much so that the original early adopters had to say, well, we've got to re-examine the model that we've been using for the last 15 years because these disruptors are impacting upon us and we've got to respond. So, that's my very sort of homespun history of what I think has happened internationally.
There's so much there, Mark, and various things that I'd love to double down on, but continue, sure. and I'll jump in.
Sure.
So I mean, just there's a lot there, and depth in each of the various points you touched on. In each of the waves, for instance, the early adopters, the Me Too, more saturation, and then the disruptors, and a lot of different areas. The one thing that's clear though, as you're speaking, is this is quite a widespread and large trend. When I gave your intro, I spoke about Harrow and the Harrow International Schools, and as you've spoken, you've talked about a lot of other brands that have done similar kinds of things, Wellington, Dulwich, and over, I think you've worked with 80 schools and universities on this. So it's clearly, something that's big, widespread over the last couple of decades. The thing I'm quite interested in here is the countries where the schools come from and the countries that they move to. And you've touched a little bit on this with, it sounds like a lot of the brands being UK brands, and then the countries they were expanding to were largely the UAE and China. Maybe just give us a bit more color on that. These UK brands, these are hundreds of years old, these schools you're talking about, charging fees, in the UK now, call it, $40,000-$50,000 or similar range in pounds per year. So some of the most prestigious institutions on the planet. Are they expanding internationally themselves? Is it at a similar price point? Is it differently? Just give us some color.
Sure. Well, before I go into UK schools, I think what I should add is that it's not just the UK that's exporting school brands, although the demand is very much, I think, skewed towards UK schools. But in addition to that, we're seeing schools from Australia, from India, particularly from India into the Middle East. We're seeing schools like GEMS, founded in the Middle East, expanding into Africa and other places around the world. Australian schools, a number of them have stepped into China, the Middle East, etc. Of course, there are a good number of American school brands, although in my experience, the demand for that surprisingly is not as great as one would imagine outside of expats. So, it's not just a trade of intellect from the UK out into other markets. It's many ways. But focusing upon UK schools for a minute, I've been fortunate to act for 3 of the schools who would claim to be amongst the 4 oldest schools in the world, going back to 800 odd. And, so they bring a great tradition. And that's something which attracts. The demand in growing economies for the best possible education has been, I think, part of what's driven the demand. And particularly in China, every parent wants to give their child the very best education and will sacrifice almost anything to procure that. And that was very much a driver. In the early days, most of the schools, foreign schools in China, were aimed at expats, and there were legal barriers to Chinese nationals being educated there. But people found ways around that. And bit by bit, it became clear that the main market was not for expats, but for Chinese nationals. And so for about 10, 15 years, that was really where the schools were growing. And that was the full K-12 experience and higher education. Universities like Nottingham successfully established a campus in China, and elsewhere in the Middle East, we saw similar trends. So there was a real demand for this product, if we can call it that, and these schools were very keen to go. In the early days, it was very much China and the Middle East, but over a period of time, we saw a bit of saturation for a while in the UAE, and in China, we had regulatory and political issues. So what I'm seeing now is that there's a lot of interest in India, a huge amount of interest in Saudi Arabia. The UAE has come back online, and there's a lot of interest there. Malaysia has, for quite a long while, been a target market because the government there has a clear national strategy to make Malaysia a regional hub for education, which basically runs like this. You want to send your child to school at a UK school. Why send them all the way from China to the UK when you can get the same education just outside of Kuala Lumpur? It's closer, it's cheaper. And so that's why Malaysia has grown quite significantly in that market. Singapore is another area of great interest. The problem there is real estate. The government regulates the sector very closely. Vietnam's another market. A lot of very positive things are said about Vietnam, but if you look at the number of schools there, it doesn't quite sit with a lot of the hype. But nevertheless, it is a market. We're seeing Indonesia also becoming more attractive. Interestingly enough, the conventional wisdom was always that South America, Latin America, just didn't have enough of a middle class with money to sustain privately funded education. But again, we're seeing inroads being made into Mexico and other Latin American countries and America. As you know, Harrow's established itself on Long Island. And to my knowledge, a number of UK schools are actively pursuing opportunities in North America. So I think, in short, everywhere's game. All these schools are looking for markets, and the school brands are becoming a little more sophisticated. They're realizing that they have to differentiate themselves from their competitors, and they're doing that in a range of different ways.
That's really fascinating. It's, one of the things you mentioned almost in passing in that entire segment there was you said you've worked with 3 of the 4 oldest schools in the world, or at least that claim to be among the oldest schools in the world. This contested history that we're stepping into here. That's absolutely extraordinary. And there is that comes with sort of tradition and the weight of time. I think there is something that appeals to parents about these extraordinary brands that have been around for hundreds of years, even if you don't go back as far as, 800, even schools that are, 5, 6, 700 years old. There's an appeal to people around the world. And that is something that's different. American brands in pretty much everything else do far better. Usually, if you think of coffee, you're going to think of Starbucks or whatever the case may be. But in education, it is slightly different because I think America's a newer country. I think go to somewhere in China, if I put you on somewhere there or put you somewhere in Singapore, people will know Eton or Harrow more than they're likely to know Harvard Westlake, for instance, in the US.
I think that's right, but there's an interesting point here. And back, it's 20 years ago, we undertook some market research in China. And essentially, we were trying to find what the brand awareness was in the education sector. And one interesting point that came out and caused much amusement was there was an open question, which was, what's the most famous British school? And you'd expect Eton, Harrow, maybe Westminster, whatever. But the overwhelming response was neither of those. It was Hogwarts.
Hogwarts. That was the first place my mind went to.
And the few words, those green playing fields, striped blazers, strange uniforms, and
the people flying on brooms.
Yeah, well, they probably didn't believe that entirely. But I think what it showed was no individual UK school had a particularly well-known brand, but Education UK certainly did. And I think that is a differentiator with the US. Just to echo your earlier comment there, people felt that they and still I think do feel they're buying heritage, they're buying history, they're buying tradition, as well as academic excellence.
That's really fascinating. And I'm intrigued because many of these schools I would expect to be non-profits in their home market. The types of schools that we're talking about, several hundreds of years old, and a sort of commercial or for-profit model, probably didn't even exist in education at the time that they were founded. But yet they're expanding internationally, and expanding internationally is not cheap. As you say, let's say you want to go to Singapore, that's very expensive real estate to be able to put down a school. So just give me some more color. How are they doing this? Is the expansion also in a non-profit way? Is there a lot of pushback at home from, the sort of old boy and old girl community? Give me some color in how this tangibly works.
Sure. Well, independent education in the UK historically has been done through charities. So the school company is a charity, which comes with a number of advantages, not least of all, you don't pay tax. And there's historically been no VAT, purchase tax, on school fees. That is changing, and everyone's known for some time it's going to change. There is now VAT on school fees. That's 20% extra. And there's a lot of pressure on independent schools in the UK. If you are a single-sex boarding school in the north of England, things are very tough. If you're a co-ed day school in North London, things are much easier. But nevertheless, the general trend is away from independence in the education sector. So as a matter of survival, these schools know that they have to find other income streams. And they're doing that in a number of different ways. But one of the most potentially attractive income streams is internationalization. Now, to do that, you need to go through a number of structural metamorphoses because a charity basically cannot internationalize. So what we tend to do, and I'm hugely simplifying this, of course, is we have to take the school, we have to set up a international trading company, we have to grant that company the right to trade internationally, and then that international trading company, if you like, will then engage with third parties using a number of different structures to find partners, to establish schools in the target markets, to have those schools developed, both in terms of the campus, and the student body, and then operate those schools in a way that echoes the ethos, the pedagogy of the home school. And, that's a real challenge. And within that, there's a whole range of different structures that have been used and are used, depending upon what the target market is, or what kind of partner we've established the relationship with, what the home market requires and demands, both commercially and in terms of the regulatory environment. So that's, one of the initial challenges which lawyers in the UK found very difficult to deal with. How do we take a charity and establish it internationally? And it was within my skill set to help them plot a way through that. But it's not just charity schools. One of the schools I've done recently for a terrific school in the north of London, Queen Elizabeth School, that's established by the first Queen Elizabeth back in the 1500s. And
Wow.
it's a state school. And yet, because of the approach, the team there and I have been able to take to internationalization, we've been able to establish a couple of deals which will soon see schools open not only in India but also in the UAE. And so there's a great skill and art, I think, to empowering schools that aren't commercial bodies to go international. But it's not impossible. And I think it's something we pretty much mastered now. The challenge is more, how does the school philosophically come to terms with operating a for-profit model? And, that is something which, historically there has been a great deal of discussion and even pushback by parents. Obviously for parents who've got children at the home school in the UK, when the good news is shared with them, the first question they have is, well, hold on, I'm paying $50,000 a year for education. I want to make sure that all the teachers are teaching my children, not, setting up a new school. And that's something which, we need to be extremely mindful of. And the work I do, I would say, is not so much on the legal structuring, although that's part of it. It's much wider than that. It's about risk management. And I would say there are 3 steps in that. And this applies to all educational organizations looking to internationalize. Step 1 is identifying the panoply of risk. What is the potential risk exposure for the home school here? And that includes legal risk, commercial structuring, the pedagogical well-being of the school, and so on. Step 2, once you've identified all those risks, is to reduce the risk to a manageable proportion. You're never going to eliminate all of the commercial, legal, and even pedagogical risk. That's just not realistic. If you think that's what you need, then you can't internationalize. But you can reduce it to a reasonably manageable proportion. And then the third task for the school is how to manage the residual risk. And that's done through structuring, commercial structuring, through the legal environment, through managing the regulatory environment, through making sure you've got a pedagogical structure that works, and from making sure there's a shared ethos, a shared pedagogy, and an esprit de corps. You can have the best legal documents in the world, you can have the best management team, you can have the best teachers, but unless there's a shared pedagogy, a shared ethos, then it's never really going to be successful. And the really successful schools I've seen are the ones who focus upon making sure the ethos in all of their schools all around the world is a shared ethos, and the values are shared. And of course, a charity and a commercial adventure don't necessarily have shared ethos and values. It can happen, and that's what successful schools, I think, manage to achieve.
It's really fascinating. Look, there's so many things that I want to touch on there. It's varying things. So let me take them one by one, so I don't do too many at once.
Sure.
Let me play back to you my understanding of the situation, and tell me if I'm getting it correctly. So, I'm a non-profit or charity school in the UK. The UK market has become significantly more challenging, and given that our schools are 500, 600, 700 years old, it also costs a lot of money, just the upkeep. I mean, a property that's 700 years old is nowhere near as efficient as one that's younger. So to avoid our school fees reaching £100,000 a year or something, really, which would be quite ridiculous. We need some other income sources in order to supplement what we're getting from parents. And when we look at what's available, one of the great things that we have is a brand, an ethos, intellectual property built up over hundreds of years. And we can work with partners in different countries, in China, in Singapore, in, any of the countries that you mentioned, Saudi Arabia. They will run the schools. They will set up and run the schools, but we will provide them the ability to use our brand, and we will have control over certain things. So some of it will be legislated, and some of it, as you say, requires a strong alignment in values and ethos, and who are the people on the other side that I'm working with. So if I'm understanding that all correctly, then I'd love to just hear some of the tangible in how this works. There'll obviously be so much nuance that we'll never be able to go through it here, but just some of the normal things, like, do they have control over which teachers are hired, or control of the curriculum? What control does the home market have?
Sure. I think first I'd just add a slight gloss to what you've said, in that many schools also have a deeply held conviction that what they produce as an educational product is something that can improve the lives of children around the world. And so there is a bit of that missionary zeal, if you like, to help improve education. It's not purely that they feel they need to make more money.
Got it. And understood, which I'm sure in the former colonies like ourselves was met with some interest.
Yes. I think that's right. I mean, it's more nuanced. It's not post-colonial imposition at all. But I think it also reflects an internationalization in terms of values around education are more internationally common than they once were. And I think, ultimately where we're seeing with this internationalization, I feel, is that these brands will not be UK brands anymore. They will be international brands that had their roots perhaps in the UK, but they are truly international schools. And this internationalization gives as much back to the UK home school in non-fiscal terms as in financial terms. And if we have time, we can talk about where I see the future. I think it's really exciting. There's funding being raised on markets. There's lots of interesting things being done with these schools. But in terms of control, what I always say to the schools I work with is the very first thing, there's two things we need to do. One is we need to make sure that we've identified, reduced, and we're managing risk. Secondly, we need to make sure that this is going to be cost neutral to you, because you don't have the ability to invest huge amounts. Thirdly, what we've got to do is to make sure that everyone's fully aligned. It's no good doing a great deal with someone who isn't totally aligned to what you want to do. And then the other is we need to be able to up stumps and go home if it doesn't work out. We need an exit strategy. And unless we have an exit strategy, we really shouldn't be entering into this. And this is where, historically, I found that many ordinary commercial lawyers don't really understand schools, because in an ordinary, if I can call it that, commercial relationship, if there's a fallout, then both parties will look at each other, they'll threaten to sue each other, neither want to, but they both know it's a possibility. And so they square up, and one party may say, I need 100 million to walk away. The other one thinks, well, I'm not paying that, but I would pay him 10 million. And so there's a lot of argument. They probably issue legal proceedings, and there's a settlement. The problem for these schools is that they're charities, and their partners know they don't have the money to get into a fight. The governors who ultimately control the schools aren't going to let them get into a fight, because that potentially will be a breach of the Charities Act, etc. So that sort of gunfight at high noon situation isn't going to happen. So what we need to do is to craft a way of exiting the relationship that doesn't involve threats of litigation. And more fundamental than that, this is never going to be a bipartite relationship. This is a tripart relationship, because you have the brand owner, the school, the home school, who delivers a blueprint for educational success. You get the partner who invests the money, who actually operates the school. I'm talking very general structural sense.
Yep.
But the third party, they're the children and the parents of the children, who are basically entrusting their futures. And so we need an exit strategy which, if we do have to dissemble the school, is one that acknowledges and prioritizes the rights of the children and the parents and the obligations that both commercial parties have towards them. And that's something which can be done. It has to be done. And yet I do see many advisors just forgetting that, really not seeing it as a basic of the structure. They see it more as a commercial issue. So, one of the most important things is we have to understand what differentiates an educational joint venture relationship from an ordinary commercial one. And that means, we do need to get things right. Now, the home school is obviously going to have to provide what I'd call a blueprint for success. It's never going to be a guarantee, because no one can guarantee success. But they've got to have an educational system that they can identify, that they're aware of. It's no good saying, well, since 1804, we've been established and we know what to do. They need to be able to show what needs to be done. They need to be aware of it. And they need to develop a new skill set, which is how to establish a new school. If they established a school back in 900, they're probably a bit rusty in 2025. So, they do need to invest, and they need to invest in advisors and skill sets. And if they don't do that, they won't be successful. What they have to do is make sure not only that they're delivering a brand and a skill set, but they also, to my mind, need to deliver that senior management team. So if I were acting for a developer, I would see one of the most essential things is for the home school to deliver the senior management team, the head, probably the deputy head, maybe the bursar, etc., and some of the heads of departments. That doesn't mean that they all have to come from the home school, but they need to be recruited by them. And the home school will have a relationship with recruiters. And, if you're, let's take a name at random, if you're Wellington College in the UK, you're probably going to find it easier to recruit top quality senior leadership team for your school in Vietnam than Ho Chi Minh High, would find if they try to recruit senior management in the UK. And they also know how to structure that senior management team, how to manage it, how to make it answerable, etc. So that's one of the very clear, tangible deliverables on day one. And then it's all about the relationship between the two schools. And that is a real art form, because you also have to accept that each local market has its own requirements. And they may be legal regulatory requirements, they may be commercial requirements, they may be simply parental environments. So, if you're a single-sex girls' school, and you go into Saudi Arabia, you have, an obvious market, but if you're a mixed-sex boarding school and you go in, then clearly you're going to have to consider what changes need to be made, if any. And those
and how that aligns with the values of the home school and the ethos. It's
absolutely,
it's a big topic.
Yeah, and that's where we need to make sure right at the beginning that we're fully aligned. And then in terms of creating the documentation and structure, my skill set is helping to capture all of that. And I think schools that don't capture that are the ones that have the real difficulty.
That's excellent, Mark. That was very, very rich and a lot of detail there. I know there's even more layers that sit beneath that, but that was really a masterclass in how these are structured. So if I look forward then into what excites you in the space and international expansion in education, could be geographies, could be themes, anything. What excites you and keeps you motivated to remain in the space?
I think fundamentally, I really enjoy working with the people in the space. After 40-odd years experience of working as a lawyer in the city, it's my favorite sector because, not everyone's perfect, but genuinely and generally, they're a pleasure to work with. And you're delivering a product that ultimately empowers young people and hopefully will make the world a better place. What in terms of technically what excites me is it's ever changing. It's ever changing. And those disruptors are still going at it. I'm working with schools that are saying, actually, we can't and we don't want to deliver a branded school. But what we can do is we can deliver educational services to existing schools, and we can empower them to deliver top quality educational modules that are beyond them at the moment. And they won't carry our name, but perhaps it's rather like Intel. It'll be Intel inside. So they're creating families of schools that are not branded after their name, but they do have a visible connection. Others are creating...
If I may interrupt you there, Mark,
sure.
There's just, something that really fascinates me there is particularly the education for special needs or neurodiverse children, where there's a lot of amazing work happening in places like Oxford, etc. And how do we get that out into other parts of the world, like here in South Africa, where there's a shortage of good quality care for neurodiverse students?
Absolutely. I've done quite a bit of work in the neurodiverse sector because I have a personal involvement with that. And one of the big barriers, in my experience, is that in many markets, parents do not want to accept that their children are neurodiverse. They still cling on to the faint hope that if you pay enough money, it will be fine. And of course, we all know that's not the case. So there's a big marketing need before neurodiverse options become viable commercially in many markets. But you're right, that's exactly the sort of educational module that schools can deliver, and creative skills as well. There's many things. So that's exciting. Then we have the digital platforms. You have some which try and deliver real academic editions, but there are others that are trying to deliver non-academic, more pastoral issues, such as international education, about not maths, not English, not the STEM subjects, but about how people are empowered or not, about environmental issues. Those are really interesting. There are political issues that need to be considered in each market, of course. There's also schools that are saying, you know what, we want to run the schools. We want to, we can't afford to fund them, but we want to run them. And that is a very interesting approach, because it opens your potential partners enormously, because you're no longer looking for partners who are able to operate the school or find someone to operate it for them. You go in, you operate it. And one structural option is, we'll come in, we'll set up the school for you, we will operate that for 5 years, and then we're out. But we're basically giving you a complete school in a box. You need to do nothing. We will set it up, we will operate it, and then we hand it over. So that's something that we're now seeing there being a lot of interest in, and schools don't realize that they actually can do this. So there's all that.
It even opens up the market of partners to real estate firms. I mean, who can find the land and build. Yeah,
that's absolutely it. Because historically, it's not been successful with real estate firms because they can't operate it, no matter what they think. And a lot of the failures that I've seen have been around that. But what schools, if they need to plan it, they can't just do it because it's a good idea. But if they give proper thought to it, they can come in and do that. Also, we're seeing now schools that are saying, we don't need a Me Too school, we can have a mini-me. So, for me, my school is 1,500 children, but I don't need to have that. I can actually have got just one school of 1,500 in, say, the US. I can have 50 schools of 400 children. And, that's a very different mindset. Of course, there are, fiscal issues, modeling issues that need to be addressed. But this is the sort of diversity of structure that I'm now working on. And it's hugely exciting. It's liberating for the schools. It's liberating for the partners. And I think it's offering great educational packages to children that otherwise wouldn't have access to them. We're also seeing more variety in fiscal models to make this educational product available not just to children who are fortunate enough to have parents who can pay high fees, but to those who actually can't. And so part of the deal, maybe 50% of the profit needs to be used to fund bursaries to bring in children from deprived backgrounds. And so there's a lot of exciting work being done on that. And I am very privileged to be a part of that, I have to say. And then we're also seeing, some schools saying, actually, we're going to be a multinational educational organization. And some of that leads to mind-boggling changes in the current traditional educational structure in the UK. For example, why does a charity have to run the school? Why don't we just sell the assets and to a commercial operation? The charity will just run the school. It won't own the property. Internationally, there'll be a school company that's just focused on internationalization. There's lots of different structures. But I know we're running out of time, so I'll leave it there.
I see. There's a lot that keeps you excited and keeps you going here, and an industry that's changing a lot as well. Look, before I come to my final question, as I've been listening to you throughout the course of this episode, the way that I bring it back to me and ground it is really, if I take I've got 3 older sisters, so I come from a family of 4, and my 3 sisters, Uziu, Zanel, and Ayanda, they all were at boarding school from grade 1. So 6 years old for 2 of them and 5 years old for 1. And they've sort of stopped that practice now in South African schools. But it's being uprooted from your parents at that sort of age. Or if I take it away from my family and if I think of some friends, being uprooted from, say, Nigeria at age 10 to go to school in the UK, or from Ghana, at age 10 to go to school in the UK. This can have a huge impact in keeping kids close to their families while still getting excellent education from some of the best institutions on the planet. And I think that can have a very, very real impact, in addition to all of the many other things that we've thought about. That is the way that I sort of brought it home and said, I see how this can be good for the students who, at the end of the day, are what this entire industry is about. It's about the students and their families.
Absolutely. I mean, one thing I didn't mention earlier, but when I was at university, I spent 3 years teaching part-time at an A.S. Neil free school. And that really opened my eyes to what education can be. And part of what I get from what I do is trying to make a broader selection of educational options available internationally. And, what you've just mentioned is certainly one part of that. It's exciting. And I think ultimately, hopefully adding a little bit of goodness to the world.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I come then to my final question, which is back to you, and Mark, and I ask the same concluding question to all of our guests. And it's my favorite question, actually, of the whole interview. And that's, please tell us about one of your favorite teachers or educators or lecturers.
Right. Well, 2 spring to mind. One was my history teacher when I did A-levels, Mr. Chilvers, who just brought a breath of fresh air in the way that he treated us like sensible adults and engaged with us in more of a Socratic form. That was thoroughly enjoyable. But I think the teacher who had the most impact on me was my tutor at university, someone called Albie Sachs. And Albie came with all sorts of merits to share. He's South African, a white South African, and he was founder member of the ANC. He was in Robben Island with Mandela, and he was expelled from South Africa, and he came to Southampton. And fortunately, he was my tutor, and he taught me many, many things about the world, about tough things that you have to confront. We had many challenging discussions about South Africa's path to liberation, about the role of the armed struggle, about the role of law, and so on. And he made me promise that after Mandela was liberated, I would go to South Africa, and I kept that promise many times. And I worked at an HIV charity for a while in Citrusdale, and Albie ultimately became the president of the Constitutional Court in South Africa. But he paid a price. Boss, the intelligence organization in South Africa, planted a bomb under his car, and he lost an eye and an arm. Yeah. And he just taught me so much about life and so much about what educators can deliver. And he delivered way more than technical legal excellence. He delivered a whole vision of life. And I'm eternally grateful to him for that.
Mark, that's a really special tribute, both to your history teacher, who I do not know, as well as to Justice Albie Sachs, who I do know. I met him when I was in university. I was a young university student, and the society that I ran, we hosted him for a talk. And he is a phenomenal human being, a phenomenal South African, to whom we owe a lot. He gave a lot of his life, and as you say, physically as well, to the struggle for freedom in South Africa, for the benefit of people like me. So that was a wonderful tribute and a surprise. Actually, I did not expect that when I asked the question. So wonderful to learn another aspect of your life that touches this country where we are here in South Africa. So thank you so much for taking the time to be with me today, and for giving a masterclass. I can hear that there's many layers in this masterclass. We could have many more on international expansion in education, but it's really been illuminating, and I've learned a lot from you. Thank you, Mark.
Well, you've been very kind, and thank you for the opportunity to share my experiences.